In the summer of 1931, a voice reverberated from the shadows of American history, offering a haunting testimony of survival, memory, and forgotten truths. This was no ordinary voice, it was the voice of Cudjo Lewis, the last surviving man from the transatlantic slave trade. Cudjo, born Kobina in West Africa, was brought to the shores of Alabama in 1860 aboard the Clotilda, the last known slave ship to smuggle enslaved Africans into the United States. His story wasn't just one of suffering and survival, but of resilience, an unyielding, defiant connection to a history that many wanted to forget. The Clotilda had arrived at the port of Mobile, Alabama, bringing with it a cargo of human lives, stolen from their homeland, destined to live in chains. But what set Cudjo apart from the countless others who experienced the horrors of slavery was that he lived long enough to tell his story. His story, in fact, became a direct link to a past that America had largely erased, ignored, or distorted. In his later years, Cudjo gave his account to Zora Neale Hurston, an ethnographer and writer who was determined to preserve the stories of Black Americans who had lived through slavery. Hurston was drawn to Cudjo's remarkable life, the last first-hand account of the brutal Middle Passage, the journey from Africa to the Americas that had claimed the lives of so many others. Cudjo's story wasn't just about the historical horrors of slavery, it was about a people, a culture, and a legacy that refused to die. Born in the kingdom of Dahomey, present-day Benin, Cudjo's memories were rooted in the life he had lived before he was kidnapped. He remembered the language, the customs, the spirituality, and the rhythms of his African homeland. His story was one of loss, of family, of identity, and of the brutal theft of his very humanity. But it was also a story of survival, of an individual who had endured unimaginable trauma and lived to tell the tale. For many, the idea of the slave trade and its impacts on the people who suffered through it can feel distant, a story from long ago, lost in the dusty pages of history. But Cudjo's voice defied that notion. His narrative was not just a personal account but a living testament to the collective experience of millions of Africans who had been torn from their land and forced into slavery. His story would not fade into the ether of forgotten histories. It refused to die, just as he had. Zora Neale Hurston's encounter with Cudjo Lewis in the 1920s would forever change the way the world understood the history of the transatlantic slave trade. Hurston, a writer who had herself emerged from the struggles of the Black community in the South, was determined to capture the stories of Black Americans who had lived through slavery, and Cudjo, with his extraordinary past, was a key figure in this mission. She visited Cudjo's home in Plateau, Alabama, a small rural community that had once been a refuge for former slaves. The man she met was old, but his memory was sharp. His words, filled with the rhythms of his African heritage, painted vivid pictures of a world long gone. The way Cudjo spoke about his experiences was raw, emotional, and deeply personal. It wasn't just a recounting of facts, it was a journey back to a time that had been lost in the winds of history. As he spoke, he recalled the agonizing details of his kidnapping, the brutal voyage across the Atlantic, and the hellish conditions aboard the Clotilda. He described the fear that gripped him and his fellow captives as they were chained together, tossed in the stinking, suffocating holds of the ship. His words brought to life the horror of the Middle Passage, a chapter in history that, for too long, had been reduced to statistics and dates. Through Hurston's work, Cudjo's story would reach a larger audience, but it was far from an easy journey. Many at the time were hesitant to confront the painful truths of slavery. The scars of the past were still fresh, and in the wake of the Civil War, Reconstruction, and the rise of Jim Crow laws, many people sought to move forward by burying the most painful memories. The country was still grappling with its history of racial violence and injustice, and for some, acknowledging the suffering of slaves felt too much to bear. But Cudjo Lewis's story refused to be buried. His voice was not just one man's account, it was a call to confront the painful legacy of slavery. In the 1930s, Cudjo's story began to appear in Hurston's writing, and while it gained some attention, it was not without controversy. There were those who questioned the authenticity of his memories, as if the depth of his trauma could somehow be dismissed. Others in the African American community were uncomfortable with the way Cudjo's story might reflect on their collective past. But for Cudjo, this was not about seeking validation. It was about telling the truth, no matter how uncomfortable or painful it might be. The fact that Cudjo was able to share his memories with Hurston in the first place was a small miracle. The community of Plateau, where Cudjo lived, was still tightly knit, and many of the descendants of other survivors of the Clotilda lived in the area. Yet, for a long time, the true scope of the Clotilda's history was hidden. The people who had survived the horrors of the Middle Passage had often been silenced, their stories ignored or forgotten in the face of a rapidly changing world. Cudjo's willingness to speak out was an act of defiance against this silence. His testimony is a reminder that history is not just a series of dates and events, but the lived experience of real people. Cudjo Lewis's story is a testament to the power of memory, to the unrelenting desire to preserve one's identity and culture despite overwhelming odds. As the last person to have directly experienced the trauma of the transatlantic slave trade, Cudjo's voice carries with it the weight of an entire forgotten history. His refusal to allow his story to be buried is a defiant stand against the forces of erasure and amnesia. In the years since Hurston's work in Cudjo's death in 1935, the story of the Clotilda and its survivors has slowly come to light. In 2019, after more than 150 years of searching, the wreck of the Clotilda was finally discovered in the Mobile River. The discovery of the ship, which had been intentionally scuttled to destroy evidence of its involvement in the illegal slave trade, was a monumental event. It was a moment of reckoning, not just for the descendants of the enslaved people aboard the Clotilda, but for the country as a whole. The discovery of the wreck provided physical evidence that validated the voices of survivors like Cudjo Lewis, who had long been dismissed or ignored. The discovery of the Clotilda and the subsequent efforts to uncover the full extent of its history serves as a painful reminder that many of the stories of slavery and its aftermath have been hidden away, often deliberately. Yet, Cudjo's voice, preserved in Hurston's writings and the growing interest in the history of the Clotilda, has ensured that this part of American history cannot be forgotten. His story continues to echo through the generations, challenging us to confront the uncomfortable truths of our past and to remember those whose voices were silenced. As we reflect on the life of Cudjo Lewis, we are reminded that history is not just about the grand narratives of nations and empires, it is about the personal stories of the individuals who lived through those times. Cudjo's story is not just a relic of the past, but a living testament to the endurance of memory, the resilience of the human spirit, and the ongoing struggle for justice and recognition. His voice, despite the passage of time, still speaks to us, urging us to listen and remember. The town of Plateau, Alabama, where Cudjo Lewis spent his later years, holds within its quiet streets and humble homes the ghosts of a forgotten history, a history that had been buried for over a century. Nestled in the rural expanse of Mobile County, Plateau might seem like any other small southern town on the surface, unassuming, isolated, and untouched by the chaos of urban sprawl. But beneath this veneer of tranquility lies a rich and painful legacy that, much like Cudjo's own life, would not be forgotten. It is here, in this forgotten corner of Alabama, that a crucial piece of American history lived on, waiting to be rediscovered. The history of Plateau, like so many towns in the South, is deeply intertwined with the legacy of slavery and the brutality of the plantation economy. The town was home to a community of former slaves who had once been forced to toil on the vast cotton plantations of Alabama, and it was here that they would try, with varying degrees of success, to build new lives after the Civil War. It was a place where the scars of slavery could not be easily erased, and where the memory of the past was carried not only in the land but in the very lives of those who had been born into bondage. Before the Civil War, Alabama had been one of the South's most heavily slave-dependent states, with large plantations stretching across the landscape, cultivating cotton, tobacco, and sugar. The cotton industry was particularly dominant, with the labor of enslaved Africans and African Americans providing the backbone for the state's economic wealth. It was in this environment that Cudjo Lewis was born, although he was far from the only one to have suffered under the yoke of slavery. His was a life marked by early loss, hardship, and violence, much like the lives of so many others in Alabama and the South at large. Cudjo's journey from his homeland in West Africa to the shores of Alabama was not an isolated one. He was one of the last people to be forcibly transported to the United States as part of the illegal slave trade, which continued even after Congress passed laws banning the importation of slaves in 1808. The Clotilda was one of the last ships to carry enslaved Africans, bringing them to the United States in direct defiance of the law. This ship, and the people aboard it, would come to symbolize the end of an era in the history of slavery, but also the beginning of a new chapter for the African American community in the United States. In the decades following the end of the Civil War, many former slaves found themselves in a world that was both new and familiar. The abolition of slavery had not ended the systemic racism and economic exploitation that black people faced in the South. The end of the war had led to the establishment of sharecropping, a system in which formerly enslaved people were given a small plot of land to farm in exchange for a portion of their crops, but they were often trapped in cycles of debt and dependence. The promise of freedom was, for many, nothing more than an illusion, and those who had been enslaved found themselves still living under oppressive conditions. It was in this environment that the survivors of the Clotilda, and Cudjo Lewis in particular, would seek to establish lives for themselves. Unlike many other former slaves, Cudjo was fortunate enough to be given land upon his emancipation, a rare opportunity in the South. He settled in Plateau, along with other survivors of the Clotilda, and the community began to build anew. They formed their own small, tight-knit society, one that preserved many elements of their African heritage. They spoke their own dialect, held on to traditional customs, and created a culture that was uniquely their own, a blend of African traditions and the experiences they had endured in America. Yet, despite these small victories, Plateau was still very much a place defined by its past. The town was marked by a complex and painful history, one that could not easily be erased. The remnants of slavery lingered in the attitudes of those around them, both black and white. African Americans in the South were still fighting against the oppressive forces of white supremacy, segregation, and disenfranchisement. The echoes of the plantation system could be seen in the way the economy was structured, the way black people were treated, and the way the memories of slavery were silenced in the public discourse. For Cudjo and the others in Plateau, the reality of living in a post-slavery world was full of contradictions. They were free, but their freedom was limited by the harsh realities of the system they lived under. They were still, in many ways, chained by the legacy of their past. But Cudjo's resilience was evident in the way he lived his life. He was not one to be easily silenced or defeated. He found ways to keep the memory of his African heritage alive, even as the world around him sought to push it into oblivion. Cudjo's story was not just one of survival, but of defiance. In the face of overwhelming odds, he held on to the knowledge of his past, the memories of his homeland, and the stories of his ancestors. This was a quiet act of rebellion, a refusal to let the brutality of slavery and the Middle Passage be forgotten. The memory of the Clotilda and its human cargo would live on in him, passed down through his words and his experiences. But the community of Plateau was not without its struggles. As the years passed, many of the survivors of the Clotilda began to fade into obscurity. The generations that followed them were no longer connected to the horrors of the past in the same way, and the culture they had built began to fade as well. The descendants of the original settlers of Plateau, while still living in the area, had grown more integrated into mainstream American society. The African traditions that had once been so important to the community were increasingly seen as old-fashioned and irrelevant. Yet, despite this, there were those who refused to let go of the past. As the years turned into decades, Cudjo's story became one of the last links to a history that was rapidly disappearing. The community in Plateau, while still holding on to their African roots, was beginning to experience the pressures of assimilation and modernization. The world around them was changing, but the past, represented by figures like Cudjo, remained a haunting presence. As the town of Plateau began to shift and evolve, there were those who fought to ensure that the memory of what had come before would not be erased. In the early 20th century, when Zora Neale Hurston made her journey to Plateau, Cudjo's story was already beginning to fade into the background. Hurston, who was working as an anthropologist at the time, recognized the importance of Cudjo's voice, and she made it her mission to preserve his story before it was lost forever. In doing so, she not only brought attention to Cudjo's individual journey, but to the larger history of slavery and the African American experience in the South. Hurston's work helped bring the voices of the forgotten men and women of Plateau, and of communities like it across the South, back into the public consciousness. The town of Plateau, with its mix of old and new, of past and present, represents the larger struggle that many African American communities faced in the aftermath of slavery. The people of Plateau were determined to move forward, to build lives for themselves, but they were also determined to never forget what had come before. The survivors of the Clotilda, and especially Cudjo Lewis, became the living embodiment of that struggle, the last remaining voices of a history that had been deliberately obscured, ignored, and often forgotten. As Plateau slowly began to change, the memory of the past began to take on new significance. It was not enough to simply survive, it was essential to remember. The town, with its unassuming streets and humble homes, became a place where the past, though painful and difficult to confront, was never allowed to disappear completely. It was a town built on resilience, memory, and the refusal to let history be forgotten. And at the heart of it all was Cudjo Lewis, whose voice would echo long after the streets of Plateau had changed, reminding us that history, when spoken, cannot be silenced. In 1860, when Cudjo Lewis was forcefully brought aboard the Clotilda, the ship that would carry him and hundreds of others from West Africa to the shores of Alabama, he had no idea that his story would one day be a vital thread in the fabric of American history. At that moment, he was just one among many, a young man, captured from his homeland, separated from his family, and thrown into a nightmare of unimaginable horrors. Yet, this journey, fraught with suffering, would become the defining chapter of his life, a chapter that would resonate through the years, echoing long after he had passed away. The Clotilda was the last known American slave ship to illegally bring enslaved Africans into the United States. While the legal importation of slaves had been banned by Congress in 1808, the illicit trade continued for several more decades. The Clotilda, captained by William Foster, was one such vessel, its owners willing to risk everything to profit from the illegal trade. The ship was a floating symbol of defiance, not just against the law, but against the very humanity of the people it carried. It was this ship, with its cramped, suffocating quarters and the stench of disease and fear, that carried Cudjo and his fellow captives on a journey they would never forget, even though the world would prefer to forget it. Cudjo's journey began in what is now Benin, in West Africa, where he was captured by rival tribes and sold to slavers. He had been living a life in his village, far removed from the brutal world that was about to unfold. His memories of his homeland were vivid and personal, he could recall the warmth of the sun, the rhythm of the life around him, the voices of his family and friends. But all of that was about to be torn away in a single, violent act. The Middle Passage, the journey across the Atlantic, would take him away from all that he knew and plunge him into the darkness of captivity. On board the Clotilda, Cudjo found himself crammed into the filthy, claustrophobic hold of the ship, surrounded by hundreds of other men, women, and children. The conditions were unbearable. The space was so tight that many captives were forced to lie on their sides for the entire journey. The stench of sweat, urine, and human excrement filled the air, and disease spread quickly among the prisoners. The human cargo was treated as nothing more than livestock, their lives worth less than the gold that could be made from their labor. The captives on the Clotilda faced unimaginable horrors, from physical abuse to psychological torment. They were shackled together, unable to move freely, and their cries for mercy were drowned out by the roar of the ocean and the cruelty of their captors. In his later years, Cudjo would recall the suffering he witnessed, the despair that clouded the souls of those on board. Yet, despite this, there was a resilience that ran through the survivors. It was a resilience that, for some, would carry them through the darkest days of their lives and into the uncertain future that awaited them on the shores of the American South. Upon arrival in Alabama, Cudjo and the other survivors were sold into slavery. They were auctioned off like cattle, their names erased, their identities stolen. Cudjo found himself on a plantation near Mobile, Alabama, working under the brutal conditions that defined the lives of so many slaves. His labor, like that of others, was used to fuel the cotton economy that had come to dominate the South. Yet, even in the depths of his suffering, Cudjo did not forget his past. He remembered his African roots, the language of his people, the culture that had been violently uprooted. The tragedy of the Middle Passage, the loss of his homeland, the break in the chain of his ancestral heritage, these were wounds that could never fully heal, but they remained a part of him forever. In the years that followed, Cudjo became part of a small community of former slaves in the rural town of Plateau, Alabama. Along with the other survivors of the Clotilda, he began to rebuild his life. Plateau, located in a remote part of Alabama, became a sanctuary for those who had endured the horrors of slavery. The town was small, but it was a place where the former slaves could find some semblance of freedom, however limited. They built homes, worked the land, and started families. And in the privacy of their new lives, they clung to the pieces of their culture that had survived the brutality of the slave trade. Cudjo's memories of his homeland remained a central part of who he was. He spoke of his African village with great detail, describing the customs, the food, and the spiritual practices that had defined his life before he was captured. But this history was not something he could easily share with the outside world. Plateau, like much of the South, was a place where the remnants of slavery and the racial prejudices that accompanied it still lingered. African traditions were often viewed with disdain or suspicion, and the desire for assimilation was strong. In many ways, Cudjo's refusal to let go of his African roots placed him at odds with the dominant culture around him. He was a man suspended between two worlds, the world of his ancestors, which he could never fully return to, and the world of his captors, which he could never truly belong to. Despite these tensions, the survivors of the Clotilda formed a close-knit community in Plateau, where they could find some measure of solace in one another's company. Yet, the pain of their past was never far behind. The town of Plateau was a reminder of what had been lost. It was a place where the wounds of the past were still fresh, even if they were often left unspoken. And in Cudjo's case, the pain of those memories only grew stronger with age. When Zora Neale Hurston visited Cudjo in the 1920s, she found a man who was still deeply connected to his African past. Cudjo had lived through the horrors of the Middle Passage and the brutality of slavery, but he had also lived long enough to see a new generation grow up in a world that, while no longer defined by slavery, was still shaped by its legacy. Hurston, fascinated by the man and his memories, sought to record his story, to preserve a part of history that was in danger of being forgotten. Cudjo's testimony became one of the last remaining first-hand accounts of the transatlantic slave trade, a story that few had been willing to tell or listen to. As Cudjo recounted his experiences to Hurston, he spoke with a clarity and depth that brought his past to life. His memories, though painful, were a testament to the endurance of the human spirit. He spoke not only of his suffering but also of the beauty of his homeland, the warmth of his family, and the strength of his people. His story was not just one of victimhood, it was one of survival, of the refusal to let his identity be erased. Cudjo's ability to recall these details, to speak of his African roots with such vividness, was a testament to the strength of his memory, even as time took its toll on his body. For Hurston, Cudjo's story was more than just a historical account, it was a window into a world that had long since disappeared. It was a world where the ties of blood and culture ran deep, where identity was rooted in the land and the people. Cudjo's memories of his homeland and his journey to America were not just about the past, they were a reminder of the importance of memory itself. They were a reminder that history is not just written in books but lived in the hearts of those who survive it. In the years after Hurston's interviews with Cudjo, his story would continue to resonate, especially as scholars and activists began to rediscover the legacy of the Clotilda and its survivors. Cudjo's voice, once lost to the world, would find its way back into the public consciousness, reminding us of a chapter in American history that had been hidden for too long. His memories, his experiences, and his legacy would continue to inspire future generations to reckon with the painful truths of the past, and to honor the voices that had long been silenced. Cudjo's journey, from his homeland in Africa to the shores of Alabama, from slavery to freedom, and from silence to voice, was one that reflected the resilience of the human spirit, the power of memory, and the unyielding strength of a man who refused to let the past be forgotten. His story, though marked by suffering and loss, was also one of survival, of defiance, and of an enduring commitment to preserve the history that had nearly been erased. Through his voice, the past would never be silenced. As the years passed, Cudjo Lewis's life in Plateau, Alabama, continued to unfold quietly, but the significance of his experiences would eventually reach the broader world. The quiet town, tucked away from the hustle and bustle of the cities, became a repository for memories that were too painful to be acknowledged by the larger society, but too important to be left in silence. Despite the physical distance from the horrors of his past, Cudjo's memories of Africa, the Middle Passage, and the life he had lost would never fully fade. He remained the living embodiment of a history that many were too uncomfortable to confront. Yet, as time moved on, his life, like those of the other survivors of the Clotilda, was marked by a tension between the past and the present, a tension that threatened to consume him as he navigated life in a country still reckoning with the scars of slavery. In the late 1920s, when Zora Neale Hurston arrived in Plateau, she came with the intention of preserving a part of history that was rapidly disappearing, an account of the transatlantic slave trade from someone who had actually lived it. At the time, the survivors of the Clotilda had largely faded into obscurity. The painful chapter of their lives was not something that the broader public wanted to remember. The collective memory of slavery, which had been brushed aside in the aftermath of the Civil War, was no longer part of the national discourse. The end of Reconstruction had ushered in a new era in the South, one defined by segregation, disenfranchisement, and the erasure of the black experience in American history. But Hurston, a writer and ethnographer who understood the importance of preserving black culture and history, recognized the significance of Cudjo's voice. She found in him not just a survivor of slavery, but a living link to a past that was slipping away from the collective memory of America. Hurston's efforts to record Cudjo's story were part of a broader attempt to preserve the stories of black Americans, particularly those who had lived through the horrors of slavery. Hurston, who had her own complicated relationship with the South and its painful history, knew that if Cudjo's story was not captured now, it might soon be lost forever. When Hurston first sat down with Cudjo, she found a man whose memories were vivid and raw. His words painted an unflinching picture of the brutality he had endured, but they also revealed a deep sense of resilience, a resilience that had carried him through years of suffering, dislocation, and loss. Cudjo spoke of the Clotilda, recounting the details of the illegal voyage, the suffocating conditions in the hold of the ship, the fear that gripped him and the others who were trapped in that floating prison. But he did not simply recount the horrors, he also spoke of his life before the capture, of his homeland in Africa, of his family, his community, and the traditions that were violently uprooted. Cudjo's ability to recall the intricate details of his African village was striking. He spoke of the village's vibrant culture, the music, the food, the rituals, and the everyday life that he had been torn from. His memories were not just of the trauma of enslavement, but of the beauty and the richness of the world he had lost. These recollections, though painful, were also an assertion of identity. They were a defiant refusal to allow his African heritage to be erased by the forces of slavery, a determination to keep that part of himself alive despite everything that had been done to strip him of it. Yet, as Cudjo's story unfolded, it became clear that his memories were not just about the past. They were also deeply tied to the present, specifically, to the lives of those who had lived through the same brutal history. Cudjo's memories were a bridge between the two worlds he inhabited, the one he had been born into, and the one he had been forced into. His recollections of his homeland were intertwined with his experiences in Alabama, and he spoke of the difficulty of reconciling these two worlds. In many ways, he felt that he had been condemned to live in the shadow of both worlds, never fully belonging to either. The tension between these two realities, the old world he had lost and the new world he had been thrust into, was a constant theme in Cudjo's life. He could not return to Africa, not physically, not emotionally. The Clotilda had taken him too far away from his homeland. And yet, the new world was no more his own than the old one had been. In Alabama, he was a freedman, but his freedom was limited. The years following the Civil War had brought about the abolition of slavery, but they had not brought equality. Cudjo and others like him had been freed from the chains of bondage, but they were still bound by the chains of racism, segregation, and economic exploitation. It was this paradox that Cudjo lived with every day. His physical freedom in Plateau was a fragile thing. The sense of community that he and the other survivors of the Clotilda had built was a solace, but it was also a reminder of what had been lost. The people of Plateau were no longer enslaved, but they were still under the weight of a past that had not been reckoned with. And as time passed, the culture they had tried to preserve, the African traditions, the language, the customs, began to fade. The younger generations, born into freedom, no longer carried the same connection to Africa that their elders did. The world around them was changing, and the South was moving on from the brutal memories of the past, burying them under layers of silence and denial. But in Cudjo's words, the past refused to stay buried. He spoke of his African village not just to recount a lost way of life, but to insist that it had meaning, that it mattered, and that it would not be erased. He spoke of the Clotilda not just to relive the pain of the Middle Passage, but to remind the world of the horrors that had been inflicted upon him and his fellow captives. For Cudjo, his memories were not a burden, they were an affirmation of his identity, a refusal to let history be written by the powerful who had erased so many voices. For Hurston, Cudjo's story was more than just an ethnographic project. It was a mission to ensure that the history of slavery was not lost to time. Hurston had a deep respect for the black experience and was determined to capture the stories of the people who had lived through it. In Cudjo, she found not just a source for her research, but a living testimony to the endurance of the human spirit. His story was not just his own, it was the story of millions of Africans who had been taken from their homes and forced into a life of unimaginable suffering. But Hurston's task was not an easy one. The South, at this time, was a place where the legacy of slavery was still very much alive, though it was often hidden beneath a veneer of politeness and denial. The idea of confronting the brutal realities of slavery was uncomfortable for many, particularly for white Southerners who wanted to move beyond the painful past. For them, the truth of slavery was too much to bear, and the voices of those who had lived through it were often ignored or marginalized. But Hurston, and later scholars, would help to elevate Cudjo's voice, and the voice of the other survivors of the Clotilda, into the public consciousness. His testimony would become part of a larger effort to uncover the hidden history of slavery and its enduring effects on African Americans. Cudjo's story, once buried in the rural South, would eventually find its place in the larger narrative of American history. But it was not just an academic exercise, it was a deeply personal story, one that spoke to the emotional and psychological scars left by slavery. Cudjo's life, and the story of the Clotilda, are a reminder that the impact of slavery did not end with the abolition of the institution. It lingered, leaving behind deep wounds that could not be easily healed. The journey from Africa to America, the brutality of the Middle Passage, the horrors of plantation life, all of these experiences shaped the lives of those who lived through them. But Cudjo's ability to remember, to speak of these things with such clarity, was a testament to the resilience of the human spirit. Even in the face of unspeakable loss, Cudjo refused to let his history be erased. As Cudjo's story began to find a wider audience, it became clear that his memories were not just personal, they were a collective memory. They were the memories of millions of Africans who had been torn from their homes and sold into slavery, and they were the memories of a country still grappling with the legacy of its past. Through Cudjo, the world began to understand that the story of slavery was not just a chapter in history, it was a living, breathing part of the present, a history that demanded to be remembered. As Cudjo Lewis's life unfolded in the rural community of Plateau, Alabama, the layers of history that shaped his existence were largely ignored by the wider world. But his survival, his resilience, and his story were undeniable, even as they pushed against the boundaries of a society that was desperate to forget its darkest past. In the decades following his arrival in America, a long and difficult process of healing, denial, and eventual acknowledgement began to take place, though the journey was far from linear. For Cudjo, the aftermath of slavery and the horrific trauma of the Middle Passage were not just memories, they were living, breathing elements of his daily life. His pain was not just a part of the past, it was something that informed how he navigated his new world, even as he tried to rebuild and create a life within the confines of freedom that often felt like a bitter illusion. The post-slavery South was a place where Black Americans, despite their newfound legal status as free citizens, were still caught in a vicious cycle of economic exploitation, political disenfranchisement, and racial oppression. While the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments had granted African Americans formal freedom and citizenship, these rights were systematically stripped away in the decades that followed, particularly after the rise of Jim Crow laws. This was a time of extreme tension, of continued segregation, violence, and the overwhelming weight of a history that had never truly been reconciled. For Cudjo, the freedom that he had longed for as a young man aboard the Clotilda was not what he had imagined. Though he had been freed from the physical chains of slavery, he was still trapped by the invisible chains of systemic racism and the psychological weight of the history he had lived through. The economic opportunities for Black men and women in the South were severely limited. The sharecropping system, which had replaced slavery in many respects, kept African Americans in a cycle of debt and dependence. While Cudjo and other former slaves had the chance to live free, they were still at the mercy of the landowners who held the economic power in the region. The promise of land and opportunity often proved to be a cruel illusion, a false hope designed to placate a population that had once been enslaved. The psychological toll of slavery was something that Cudjo carried with him long after his formal emancipation. Even in the relative peace of Plateau, where he had settled with other survivors of the Clotilda, there was a constant reminder of the horrors they had lived through. The memories of the Clotilda, of the brutal conditions aboard the ship, of the lives that had been lost during the Middle Passage, these were not things that could be erased. They were part of who Cudjo was, just as his memories of his homeland in Africa were. The tragedy of being torn from his family, from his village, from everything he knew, was a wound that never truly healed. Even in the years of relative peace in Alabama, that pain continued to shape his life in ways that were impossible to ignore. And yet, despite the suffocating weight of that past, Cudjo refused to be defined by it. He was determined to live, to survive, and to create a life for himself. His community in Plateau was a testament to this resilience. The town, built by former slaves and their descendants, was a place of shared experience and collective memory. The people of Plateau had been through the same trauma, and in many ways, they were bound together by it. They understood the suffering, the loss, and the trauma that came with being a part of the Clotilda's ill-fated journey, and they found ways to support one another, to create a sense of home in a world that had torn them apart. However, the act of surviving was not enough. Cudjo's desire to preserve his identity, to pass on his story, was a powerful form of resistance. He knew that the broader world had little interest in hearing the stories of the enslaved, and even less interest in understanding the full scope of the trauma they had endured. The painful memories of slavery were not just private struggles, they were part of the history of the nation, a history that had been distorted, ignored, or deliberately erased. This was why Cudjo's willingness to speak to Zora Neale Hurston, to tell his story, was so important. His memories were not just personal, they were a collective testament to the endurance of an entire people. They were the kind of memories that could not, and should not, be forgotten. Hurston, a writer and ethnographer who had grown up in the South, recognized the importance of Cudjo's voice. She had dedicated much of her career to capturing the stories of Black Americans, particularly those who had lived through slavery. Hurston's work was revolutionary in its time, offering a rich and nuanced portrait of African American life and history. But her work was also controversial. The mainstream literary world was not interested in stories that did not fit into the comfortable narratives of white America. Hurston's exploration of Black life, particularly in the rural South, was often dismissed, and the voices of her subjects, many of whom had experienced the trauma of slavery, were too raw and unsettling for a society that preferred to move on, to bury its painful history. Yet, Hurston's work would help to ensure that Cudjo's story was not lost to time. When she sat down with him in the 1920s, she did not just document his story for the sake of academic inquiry. She captured something far more profound, the voice of a survivor who had lived through the worst of humanity and had emerged with a clear sense of self, a man who refused to let his history be erased. In Cudjo's words, Hurston found the essence of the African American experience, one marked by resilience, pain, survival, and, ultimately, the drive to preserve one's identity. When Hurston recorded Cudjo's testimony, it was not simply a retelling of events. Cudjo's words were imbued with the emotional weight of a man who had lived through unimaginable horrors and emerged with a deep understanding of the world around him. Hurston's interviews with Cudjo are filled with intimate details, not just about the Clotilda, but about the loss of culture, the brutal separation from his homeland, and the longing for a past that could never be reclaimed. Hurston captured Cudjo's reflections on the horrors of the Middle Passage, but she also captured the strength and dignity of a man who refused to be reduced to his trauma. His story was not just one of victimhood, it was also a story of resistance, of a man who had fought to keep his identity intact despite the forces that sought to erase it. The fact that Cudjo's story was preserved in Hurston's work was a triumph. It allowed for a part of history that had been marginalized, silenced, and ignored to be heard. But the process of telling his story was not easy, and it was not without resistance. There were those who were uncomfortable with the idea of confronting the brutal truths of slavery, who wished to avoid the pain of remembering. The larger American public had long been uncomfortable with the legacy of slavery, and the voices of former slaves were often ignored or suppressed. For many, the truth of slavery was something that had been buried in the past, something that should remain forgotten. But Cudjo's testimony would not be forgotten. As his words were passed down through Hurston's work, they would continue to resonate. The impact of his story would be felt far beyond the confines of Plateau. Over time, the historical significance of the Clotilda, the last known slave ship to bring Africans to the United States, would come to be understood in a new light. Cudjo's voice, his memories of Africa, of the Clotilda, of his life in Alabama, would be recognized as a vital link to the past, a past that needed to be acknowledged and understood, no matter how painful. In the years following Hurston's interviews with Cudjo, the legacy of his story would continue to unfold. The Clotilda remained hidden in the waters of the Mobile River, but the memory of the ship, and of the people who had survived it, would eventually be brought to the surface. It wasn't just the ship that had been hidden, but the lives of those who had been stolen by it, the lives of those who had lived through the unimaginable and whose stories had been suppressed for so long. Cudjo's story would serve as a reminder that the past cannot be ignored, that the trauma of slavery cannot be erased, and that the voices of survivors must be heard. His life, his memories, and his testimony were not just part of history, they were a living, breathing testament to the resilience of the human spirit. And in telling his story, Cudjo had ensured that the history of the Clotilda and its survivors would never be forgotten. As the years passed and Cudjo Lewis's life in Plateau continued, the broader historical context surrounding him began to shift. Plateau, a quiet and seemingly inconspicuous town in rural Alabama, held within it the stories of a people whose history had long been ignored, silenced, and overlooked. It was a town shaped by the legacies of slavery and the continued oppression of African Americans in the South, but it was also a place where a community of former slaves, including Cudjo, had managed to find a sense of autonomy and belonging. It was here, among these survivors, that the real impact of slavery could be understood, not just as a set of historical events, but as a lived experience that continued to echo through their lives, shaping the world they inhabited. Yet, the trauma of slavery was not something that could simply be left behind. The aftermath of slavery in the South was marked by a relentless cycle of racial violence, economic exploitation, and psychological trauma. For Cudjo, the struggle to reconcile the history of his past with the world he found himself in was a constant challenge. While his physical freedom had been granted after the Civil War, the mental and emotional scars left by slavery were not so easily healed. The trauma he carried with him from the Middle Passage, from the brutal conditions aboard the Clotilda, and from the subsequent years of forced labor on plantations, was something that would shape the entirety of his life. For Cudjo and the other survivors of the Clotilda, freedom did not mean the end of their struggle. The post-Reconstruction South, though no longer dominated by the institution of slavery, remained a place where the power dynamics were largely unchanged. The legacy of slavery persisted in the form of segregation, disenfranchisement, and the harsh realities of economic and social inequality. Black Americans, particularly in the rural South, were still systematically excluded from full participation in society, and their efforts to build lives of dignity were continually undermined by a culture that sought to minimize their humanity. In many ways, the survivors of the Clotilda found themselves at a crossroads. They had been through the most unimaginable horrors, and yet they had survived. They had fought, not just for their freedom, but for their very survival. But their lives in the post-slavery South were still shaped by the same structures of racial oppression that had defined their existence during the time of slavery. Cudjo, in particular, felt the weight of this every day. His memories of Africa, of the life he had once known, were vivid and painful reminders of what he had lost. But they were also a source of strength, a testament to his resilience and determination to survive. While the world around him sought to move on, to bury the painful history of slavery under layers of silence and denial, Cudjo held on to his memories, refusing to let them fade. His recounting of his story, especially to Zora Neale Hurston in the 1920s, was not just a personal reflection, it was an act of resistance. He understood the power of memory, the importance of preserving the past so that it would not be lost to history. His voice, though long silenced by a society that had little interest in hearing it, would become an essential part of the national conversation about slavery, race, and memory. Cudjo's decision to speak to Hurston was a pivotal moment, not just in his life, but in the larger effort to document and preserve the stories of African Americans who had lived through the horrors of slavery. Hurston, a pioneering black writer and anthropologist, understood the value of Cudjo's testimony. She recognized that his story was not just an individual one, it was a collective story, one that spoke to the experiences of millions of Africans who had been forcibly brought to America, and of the generations that followed them. Hurston's work, especially her interviews with Cudjo, was a key part of the larger effort to document the black experience in the South, to capture the stories of those who had lived through the brutal legacy of slavery and its aftermath. In many ways, Cudjo's life was a living history, a testament to the endurance of the African spirit in the face of unimaginable adversity. His memories of Africa, of the life he had once known, were an integral part of his identity. They were not just distant recollections of a lost world, but active components of his sense of self. His African heritage, though forcibly erased by the brutal realities of the slave trade, was something that Cudjo clung to throughout his life. He spoke of his homeland with a deep reverence, recounting the customs, the traditions, and the spiritual beliefs that had been an integral part of his life before he was captured and brought to the United States. For Cudjo, these memories were not just fragments of the past, they were a vital part of his identity, something that could never be taken away from him, even in the face of slavery's horrors. The psychological toll of slavery was something that shaped Cudjo's life in ways that were not immediately visible. His struggles were not just physical, but emotional and psychological. The trauma of being forcibly taken from his homeland, of being sold into slavery, of watching the world he had known disintegrate before his eyes, left deep scars that would never fully heal. For Cudjo, the pain of that loss was something that was always present, lingering in the background of his life. But it was also something that he had learned to live with, something that he had learned to carry as part of who he was. The community of Plateau, where Cudjo and other survivors of the Clotilda had settled, was a place where the scars of the past were acknowledged but not allowed to define the future. The people of Plateau had been through unimaginable suffering, yet they had managed to create lives for themselves in the shadow of their past. They had built homes, started families, and formed a close-knit community that helped them survive the ongoing struggles they faced. But despite their best efforts to move forward, the past remained an ever-present shadow. The memories of the Clotilda were not easily erased, and the impact of slavery was not something that could be easily outrun. In this community, Cudjo's story was not just his own, it was the story of all those who had survived the horrors of the slave trade. It was a story that had been suppressed for too long, a story that needed to be told if the truth of slavery and its legacy was ever to be fully understood. By sharing his story with Hurston, Cudjo was giving voice to a history that had been deliberately buried. He was taking ownership of his narrative and ensuring that it would be preserved for future generations. Despite the strength of his memories and the resilience that had carried him through the worst of times, Cudjo was still a man shaped by the world he had survived. He had seen the depths of human cruelty and loss, and those experiences had left their mark on him. But he was also a man of dignity and strength, a man who refused to be defined by his past. His life in Plateau was not just a story of survival, it was also a story of defiance, a defiance against the forces that had tried to erase him and his people, a defiance against a world that had sought to strip him of his identity and his humanity. As Cudjo's story began to find its place in the larger narrative of American history, it became clear that his voice was one of the last remaining connections to a history that had been buried. The Clotilda, once a symbol of the cruelty of the slave trade, had remained hidden in the waters of the Mobile River for many years. But with the discovery of the ship and the renewed interest in the history of the Clotilda's survivors, Cudjo's story would come to symbolize not just the pain of slavery, but the resilience of those who had lived through it. Cudjo's journey, his survival, his defiance, and his refusal to be erased, was a reminder of the enduring power of memory. It was a testament to the fact that even in the face of overwhelming trauma, the human spirit could not be extinguished. His story, shared with Hurston and later with the world, would continue to resonate for generations to come. Cudjo had not just survived slavery, he had lived, and in doing so, he had ensured that the history of the Clotilda and its survivors would never be forgotten. His life, though marked by pain and loss, had become a beacon of hope, a reminder that history, when remembered, cannot be silenced. The years following Cudjo Lewis's conversations with Zora Neale Hurston saw a gradual transformation in how the larger American public began to engage with the painful, often forgotten stories of slavery. For decades, the voices of former slaves had been systematically silenced or disregarded. The trauma of slavery had been hidden, pushed to the margins of historical narrative. But through the careful documentation of figures like Cudjo and the growing interest in their stories, a long-buried history began to re-emerge. The significance of Cudjo's voice lay not only in the specifics of his personal experiences but in what his life and testimony symbolized. Cudjo's story, as recounted by Hurston, gave a human face to the brutality of the transatlantic slave trade, a trade that had too often been treated as an abstract or distant phenomenon. For many who were unfamiliar with the realities of slavery's generational effects, the discovery of Cudjo's history, his memories, and his life in Plateau acted as an emotional and educational bridge to the past. His account not only chronicled the searing pain of the Middle Passage and the institutionalized violence of slavery but also painted a picture of a man who had managed, despite all odds, to preserve his humanity and a connection to a culture that had been violently torn away. For Cudjo, the chance to tell his story was not just a way of reclaiming the past but also an act of defiance against a world that had consistently attempted to erase people like him from the historical record. His recounting of life on the Clotilda, of the conditions that made the voyage infamous, was an attempt to bring his own experiences, and the experiences of all the people enslaved on that ship, into the light. It was a stark reminder of the fundamental injustice of the transatlantic slave trade, where human beings were commodified, treated as chattel, and transported across oceans under the most harrowing conditions imaginable. However, Cudjo's story was also a reflection of the complex ways in which memory and history work. While Hurston's interviews with him captured his voice in a way that was new and vital for the public, these memories were not static, they were part of a larger, ongoing conversation about race, identity, and belonging in America. The act of remembering was always a political one, deeply intertwined with the lived experience of survival. For Cudjo, each recounting of his memories, each revisitation of the horrors of the Clotilda, was a layered process of self-reflection. The pain of recalling the atrocities, of confronting the disintegration of his homeland, was cathartic but also necessary. His refusal to forget the past became, in itself, a form of resistance, a resistance to the erasure of his culture, his ancestors, and the legacy of the violence that had been inflicted upon him. But Hurston's interviews with Cudjo also exposed a deeper tension. While his testimony brought some measure of public attention, it was not without its complications. The larger society in which he lived had a complex relationship with the history of slavery, one that was often rooted in denial or minimization. In the South, racial violence was still rampant. The trauma of slavery was too raw, too painful, for many to confront in full. The conversations around race and slavery had become polarized, often framed in ways that tried to avoid engaging with the emotional and psychological wounds left behind by the institution. For many in the white South, acknowledging the violence of slavery was not just uncomfortable, it was threatening. It threatened the deeply ingrained social and political structures that had sustained white supremacy for centuries. It threatened the very notion of American exceptionalism, the idea that the United States was a beacon of liberty and justice. To engage with the full history of slavery, to confront the fact that the United States had built its economic and cultural power on the backs of enslaved Africans, was a radical act. It forced people to reckon not just with the brutality of the past, but with its present-day implications. The echoes of slavery were not just historical, they were visible in the segregation, disenfranchisement, and violence that African Americans continued to face in the 1920s and beyond. But Cudjo's refusal to let the past be buried was also an act of reclaiming his dignity and his power. He was a man who had lived through the most brutal systems of oppression, and he had survived. He had witnessed the violence of the Clotilda, he had endured the torment of slavery, and he had managed to hold on to his identity. His story was not just one of suffering, it was also one of strength, of resilience, and of survival. Cudjo's dignity lay not just in what he had survived, but in the way he chose to live and, more importantly, in the way he chose to remember. His memories were part of his victory over the forces that had tried to erase him. But the preservation of Cudjo's memories also created a ripple effect that would go on to influence the way the broader society engaged with the legacies of slavery. His voice, once marginalized, became an integral part of the historical narrative that emerged during the 20th century, as scholars and activists began to demand that the history of African Americans and slavery be placed front and center in the national conversation. Cudjo's testimony, alongside the stories of other survivors of the Clotilda, was part of a much larger effort to rediscover and reclaim the lost histories of African Americans, particularly those whose lives had been shaped by the trauma of slavery. In the years after Hurston's interviews, there was a growing recognition of the importance of these stories. In the 1960s and 1970s, during the height of the civil rights movement, the fight for racial equality would be deeply intertwined with the effort to uncover and confront the hidden histories of Black Americans. The testimonies of former slaves like Cudjo would eventually become critical sources of knowledge for understanding the brutal legacies of racism, slavery, and segregation in America. These personal narratives, often viewed as unimportant by mainstream historical scholarship, began to receive greater attention and were seen as vital pieces of a much larger puzzle. However, for many of the Clotilda's survivors, including Cudjo, the long-term legacy of their survival was not just academic or historical, it was personal. In his old age, Cudjo lived with the knowledge that his story would be passed down through generations. He was acutely aware that his memories of the past, as painful and difficult as they were valuable. In a country that had largely failed to reckon with the legacies of slavery, his testimony served as a reminder that those who had been enslaved were not merely passive victims, they were active agents in the story of their survival. But the impact of Cudjo's life and story was not confined to his time. His legacy stretched far beyond his years. In the decades after Hurston's work, the plight of African Americans would continue to be a central issue in American life, and the efforts to preserve and honor the memories of slavery would continue to be crucial in the national conversation. As scholars, activists, and ordinary citizens looked back at the histories of enslaved people like Cudjo, they recognized the importance of understanding slavery not just as a historical event, but as a long-lasting and ongoing process of social, economic, and psychological injury. The endurance of Cudjo's memories, his insistence on telling his story, was, in a very real sense, an act of defiance against a world that had sought to suppress the truth. His words would continue to speak to future generations, challenging them to confront the uncomfortable truths of the past. In the end, Cudjo's testimony, his life, his memories, his resilience, became not only an essential part of the history of the Clotilda, but a testament to the larger history of the African diaspora in the Americas. His story, once lost to the forgotten corners of history, would find its place in the collective consciousness of a nation that could no longer ignore the legacies of its past. The story of Cudjo Lewis, as it reached a wider audience in the years following Zora Neale Hurston's interviews, became more than just an individual narrative. It became a living testament to the resilience of a people whose history had been so often erased. Cudjo's journey from the brutal capture and traumatic middle passage aboard the Clotilda to his life in Plateau, Alabama, was one of survival, but it was also a profound act of resistance. His ability to hold on to his memories, to preserve the cultural heritage of his African roots, was a defiance of those who sought to strip him and others like him of their identity, their humanity, and their history. As the decades passed, his story evolved from a local account to an essential part of the collective American consciousness, a bridge between the horrors of the past and the ongoing struggles for racial justice in the United States. In the years after Hurston's interviews, the broader narrative of slavery in America began to shift. The history of the Clotilda, the last known ship to bring enslaved Africans to the United States, and its survivors, remained largely obscured until the latter half of the 20th century. The discovery of the wreckage of the Clotilda in 2019, over a century after it had been deliberately scuttled to hide its illegal voyage, brought renewed attention to the people who had been on board, including Cudjo. This discovery provided a tangible link to a history that had long been buried beneath the weight of time and denial, and it underscored the continued relevance of Cudjo's story for understanding the long-lasting impacts of slavery. For Cudjo, however, the wreckage of the ship was not just a historical curiosity, it was a profound symbol of the violence and degradation he had experienced. The fact that the Clotilda had been deliberately sunk to prevent its discovery was an indication of the lengths to which those involved in the illegal slave trade had gone to erase the evidence of their actions. The ship's existence, and its eventual unearthing, revealed how deeply the powers that be had wanted to bury the truth of slavery, not just for legal and economic reasons, but also to avoid confronting the moral and psychological consequences of what had been done to millions of people. Cudjo had lived through the brutality of the slave trade, the violence of the plantation system, and the psychological scars that came from having one's identity ripped away. But he was also a man who had survived, who had built a life, and who had managed to preserve the essence of who he was. In Plateau, Cudjo and his fellow survivors of the Clotilda found a semblance of community, a place where their shared trauma was not only understood but respected. But even here, the legacy of slavery loomed large. While they were no longer bound by physical chains, the mental and emotional scars of enslavement could not be easily erased. These survivors, like Cudjo, had to live with the knowledge that their lives had been shaped by forces beyond their control. The system of slavery had left them with a legacy of displacement, trauma, and profound loss. And yet, despite the weight of that legacy, Cudjo's life in Plateau was marked by a defiance that was not always immediately visible. On the surface, he was a man who had lived through the worst of human suffering, yet he carried himself with dignity, a quiet strength that spoke volumes about the depth of his resilience. But this resilience was not without its struggles. As an elderly man, Cudjo had to reckon with the painful contradictions that existed within his own life. He was free, yes, but in a world that continued to deny him and his community the full measure of their humanity, how much freedom was really left? In the 1920s, when Hurston came to Plateau to interview Cudjo, the nation was in the midst of a period of significant racial tension. The Great Migration had begun, with millions of African Americans fleeing the oppressive conditions of the South for better opportunities in the North. The South, meanwhile, remained entrenched in its racial segregation and economic exploitation. In the wake of Reconstruction, the South had developed a system of institutionalized racism that sought to relegate African Americans to second-class citizenship. The Jim Crow laws that had been enacted after the Civil War had created a legal framework that upheld segregation in virtually every aspect of life. The lives of African Americans in the South were defined by a constant battle against systemic injustice, violence, and discrimination. Cudjo's life in Plateau, though physically distant from the more public acts of racial violence, was still shaped by the broader cultural and social forces that perpetuated white supremacy. His freedom, like the freedom of millions of other African Americans, was limited by the entrenched systems of racial hierarchy that defined every aspect of life in the South. Even as Cudjo had built a life for himself in the wake of slavery, he was constantly reminded of the fact that his humanity was still seen as less than that of white Americans. The freedom he had fought for and won was not the full measure of autonomy he had dreamed of as a young man aboard the Clotilda. He lived in a world where his worth was constantly being minimized, his dignity denied, and his rights restricted. This paradox, this tension between physical freedom and the social constraints imposed upon him, was something that many African Americans of his generation struggled with. For Cudjo, the memories of slavery, of the horrific conditions on the Clotilda, of the brutality he had endured, were never far from his mind. But as he aged, those memories took on a different dimension. They became a way of asserting his identity, of refusing to let the world forget what had been done to him and his people. The act of remembering was not just a way of preserving the past, it was a form of resistance. It was a rejection of the idea that the past should be forgotten or swept under the rug. Through his memories, Cudjo was asserting his right to be seen, to be heard, and to be recognized as a full human being, deserving of dignity and respect. For Cudjo, the legacy of the Clotilda and his life in Plateau was inextricably linked to the larger struggle for racial justice in the United States. His story was not just about the pain of slavery, it was also about the ongoing fight for recognition, for equality, and for the right to live with dignity in a world that had consistently denied black people those very things. His refusal to forget, to remain silent, was part of the larger movement to reclaim African American history and identity in a society that had long marginalized those voices. As the years went by, Cudjo's story took on an increasing significance in the broader national conversation about race, memory, and identity. The civil rights movement, which would gain momentum in the 1950s and 1960s, was built on the shoulders of those who had fought for freedom and equality for generations. The struggle for racial justice had deep roots in the history of African Americans, and Cudjo's life, his survival, and his defiance were a living link to that history. His story was part of a larger effort to ensure that the history of slavery, and the ongoing struggles of African Americans, would not be forgotten. The rediscovery of the Clotilda wreckage in 2019 only served to underscore the ongoing relevance of Cudjo's story. As the last known slave ship to bring Africans to the United States, the Clotilda was a powerful symbol of the horrors of the transatlantic slave trade. The discovery of the wreckage brought a new level of public attention to the people who had been aboard the ship, and it served as a stark reminder of the deep historical roots of racial injustice in the United States. The wreckage was not just an archaeological curiosity, it was a symbol of the ongoing struggle for racial equality and recognition in the modern era. For Cudjo, his life and his story had become part of the broader cultural and historical fabric of America. His refusal to let the past be buried, his determination to preserve the memories of his African heritage, and his insistence on speaking the truth about his experiences aboard the Clotilda were acts of profound resistance. They were a refusal to let his story, his people's story, be erased by the forces of history, denial, and silence. As his story continued to be shared and celebrated, Cudjo's legacy grew in significance. He became not just a figure in the history of the Clotilda or a representative of the horrors of slavery, he became a symbol of survival, dignity, and the power of memory. In a world that often sought to silence the voices of the oppressed, Cudjo's voice, his memories, would not be ignored. His story, once buried in the past, had become an enduring testament to the resilience of the human spirit and the importance of remembering history in all its painful complexity.